Hello everybody, I'm Mr. Zinzin. Today I tell you the most thrilling and horror-esque stories. Please subscribe, share and enjoy. I need help identifying something I saw around 2 years ago. I will describe the incident and 2 possible connected incidents following. I had just returned from a 5-year active duty tour in the U.S. Army Infantry a few months prior. So naturally, I was in party mode. We decided to do a bit of drinking on Friday night and it carried into Saturday. There was a bit of small narcotic use but nothing major or harmful. Mods, please don't remove this for that statement. I just want to be as exact as possible in case any small detail helps identify this thing. After a full 48 hours of sleep-deprived fun, my fiancée and I went to bed after my friends left. I finally shut my eyes and I felt her sit up and shout, "What the F?" I opened my eyes to see a dark green lanky skinny figure sitting on her side of the bed with its arm extended above us reaching for either her or myself, that's unclear. Every light in the 1-bedroom apartment was off so it was pitch black, so I don't know if it emitted light or not. It had very long fingers almost like claws. I didn't bother looking for a face. I pulled her from the bed quickly as she was frozen scared, dragged her out of the house and we ran to a neighbor's. He was a good friend of mine and believed me and let us relax there for a while. We returned hours later and nothing else ensued until a few weeks later. She sat up quickly and woke me with a shake and I awoke to see her sweating and panicked. She described to me as what we later found to know as sleep paralysis with a bit of research. The same thing happened to me around a week later and I immediately found us a new place to live. During the paralysis episode neither of us heard or saw anything, theirs was just an overwhelming sense of fear. Around 2 months later I experienced this sleep paralysis again. I opened my eyes as I was asleep on my mother's couch. I stayed the night only to help with maintenance around the house. I couldn't move, couldn't talk. My leg began to lift in the air, though I saw nor felt anything grabbing it. I asked God for help in my mind. Whether I closed my eyes and opened them or if I awoke from a dream is still very unclear. I will now describe my 2 prior paranormal, religious experiences before all this. When I was 8 years old I was involved in a near-fatal car accident with my father whom I rarely saw. I was rushed to the hospital where I almost died. I fell unconscious immediately upon arrival to the ER. All I remember seeing was pitch black until a very tiny speck of light grew larger until a woman stepped out of it in an all-white robe who I recognized as my grandmother who had died 3 years earlier in her sleep. She said nothing, she only extended her hand to me as if wanted me to go with her. I cried and shouted, "No, I want my mom please." She then stepped into the light and as it grew smaller my eyes opened to find myself staring into the operating table light. I was on my first and last 12-month tour to Kandahar, Afghanistan. We had just came home from a 3-day mission where persistent fighting ensued. I went to sleep immediately after eating, cleaning my weapon, inspecting my soldiers' weapons and showering. I woke up sweating and breathing hard, barely remembering what I had just dreamt. I pieced it back together after about 10 minutes. I had a dream began with me looking down on myself from above, lying on a couch in what appeared to be an unfamiliar house or apartment. As my mother and grandmother, the one still living, stood over me asking if I was alright, I was persistently shouting and cursing at them. They left and a Catholic priest walked in and opened a Bible. I'm not even Catholic, I'm Baptist. As he read in what sounded to be Latin, I began to yell a very long single yell that began as my own voice and slowly turned to a deep horrifying, beastly yell unlike anything I'd ever heard. The room began to vibrate violently and then so at my eyes, then ears, then whole body. It was such a violent vibrating, that's what woke me up. The entire dream was viewed from a fixed point of view, from the ceiling looking down on myself laying the couch. Ever since I returned home from overseas after having this dream and through all the other events, no matter where I am, I feel something watching me from behind. I don't know why but I feel like it's a black sort of mist in the farmers of the Kikings wherever I am when I picture it in my mind. Left as is, OP may need to clarify. Can anyone identify the green figure? Or give me some clarification to any of this? I just want to know what is going on and why I have felt this presence for the past few years. This is a genuine story and I have never really pieced it together or told anyone about it as a whole until now. Can anyone help me? Ryan. After my dog attacked my daughter, we had him put down. I could not simply let another family take him knowing what he was capable of. Perhaps that's what triggered a series of more pronounced paranormal events. Several of my family members started seeing black shadowy figures. My youngest daughter woke many times during the night to see a very tall dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. When she turned her bedside lamp on, it would be gone. We tried to recreate this figure unsuccessfully to see if it may have been something in her room, and her imagination got the best of her. Soon after that, or while that was still going on, I started noticing a tall dark shadow man standing in the corner of my kitchen. Usually I only saw him after glancing over my shoulder, just a quick look. I would turn around fully, he would be gone. At first I thought perhaps it was just my imagination, my denial rearing its head again, a reaction to my daughter relating what she was experiencing. However, my other two dogs started avoiding that corner at all costs. I'll get into that in my next story. Things kept happening, shadow figures, stuff missing, feeling a tug on the back of our legs as we walked down the hall. Voices as if they were far away. At times I would be in the living room and one of the kids, usually my youngest, would walk in and ask what I wanted. She would tell me she heard me calling her. In fact, that happened from the moment we moved into the house, hearing someone call out our names. We just all discounted it as our imaginations. Every day something happened. Every single day. I probably won't get all of it down in this story cause most of it I consider trivial. A lot of it I've forgotten, but I'm sure at some time I will remember. It's things that I've been through before, so it's easy to just shrug my shoulders at and go on with life. Then came of the night of December 16, 2009. My oldest daughter and her husband had just moved in with us. Their bedroom was across the hall, down away from ours. My youngest daughter's room was directly across the hall. My youngest son's room was at the other end of the hall. I'm making a note here that my oldest son, who had experiences but is a total non-believer, had moved out several years prior to this. I remember the above date clearly because it's also our wedding anniversary. I woke up at 2:22, I know the time because I immediately looked at the clock. What woke me was what sounded like an ice cream truck playing the song "Do Your Ears Hang Low." My first thought was, why the hell is the ice cream truck running in the middle of the night? As the sound got louder, I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door. It sounded as if the truck was inside of the house and coming towards me. About that time my oldest daughter opened her bedroom door. She looked at me as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She asked, "Do you hear that?" By this time the sound was deafening. I'm not even sure if I actually heard her words or I had just read her lips. Then suddenly it stopped. I can't even begin to explain how badly we both were shaken. We kept asking each other, did that really happen? Neither of us went back to bed that night. We sat up talking about it, trying to find a reasonable explanation for it. Trying to figure out why no one else in the house woke up. The one question neither of us thought to ask was, why would the ice cream truck run in December? A few days later it dawned on me, our ice cream truck only runs during spring and summer. But just to make sure I called the owner and asked what his operation times were. He told me, he runs the trucks from noon until 8 p.m. March 1st through September 1st. The first house was my great-grandparents in Orem. My mom was young when this happened. She would hear footsteps walking up and down the hallways and sometimes would hear voices. Everyone would hear them but never gave it any attention. So my mother asked her grandma what the sounds were. She told my mom it was her great-grandpa. Now being young she just said okay, not worried. Until she was in her teens she connected the dots. She remembers her and all of her cousins who were there being rushed to the neighbor's house 2 houses down. Police and an ambulance coming to the house. Her great-grandpa had shot himself in the living room maybe a year or 2 before asking. The second house was my great-grandparents on my dad's side. His aunt was a teenager at the time and would play the Ouija board upstairs in the bedroom. After they had moved out, my mom's uncle moved in with his wife and 3 kids. The twin brothers slept in that bedroom and would always complain about hearing things. All the lights, radio and TV would be off up there, but when you were downstairs they would all turn on. You could hear things moving and also footsteps. One night my aunt had a strange feeling before going to bed. While sleeping she woke up to the bathroom light on. As soon as she looked up she saw what she said was a demon-like figure floating above her. My family is Catholic, so she called the priest to bless the house and they moved out. And within a couple years and many people moving in and out, one day the house caught on fire with no explanation. The third is my very own story. Since I was little my mom told me I would always wake up at 3 a.m., and it still would happen every night before I got my own place. I can still look back and remember dark figures in my childhood. And in the house my family lives in I would see figures in front of my doorways, hear things being knocked off shelves in our storage room, and water being turned off and on. I have 2 dogs and when they are in the house at night or when I am home alone they will both all of the sudden run to the top of our stairs and bark, growl and whine. Also our cat, when she had kittens we put them downstairs in the storage room next to mine, so the dogs wouldn't bother them. She would always be scared and clawing at the door. And when she managed to go upstairs she would throw a fit going back down. Wouldn't leave her babies because of how scared she was. One night I woke to scratching at the foot of my bed. No animals were down there at this time. And as I looked around my room I could see the dark figures all around. I was terrified. I didn't move, was hysterical. I called my mom on my cell phone to come get me. My mom thought I was crazy because she couldn't see anything. So I did some research and my best friend at the time had lived in the neighborhood her whole life. And she knew the lady that lived there before. She told me that she had a heart attack and died by our storage room. My cousin, who is very sensitive, was invited over and told my mom about the woman and of others. My mom never said anything to her. Things started to happen to my mom after that. Like the downstairs door opening by itself in front of her. We were laying in her room one night, and I can't sleep with doors open from seeing figures my whole life, so I closed every door in her room and fell asleep. At about 3 a.m. we woke from what sounded like a pill bottle being thrown at the wall and every door being open. Sorry it's so long guys. Wanted to get my stories out. Ever since I was little I always had the feeling I was being watched, like I was never alone. Recently over the years it's only gotten worse. Half my life I've always seen a woman in a long white dress around my house, and judging by what my mom has told me it could be my grandmother. She died by an exploding blood vein in her brain. There was nothing the doctors could do and she died a slow and painful way. My mom tells me I'm a lot like her. The thing is I never got to meet her. She died a year and a day before my birthday. That still shocks me to this day. I'm not sure if it's her though because I've never seen the figure's face. Then recently, a few months back, I used to see a little boy maybe 7 or 8 years old and he'd always be by or behind something. I took a photo once because my dogs were barking at my porch door. When I examined the photo I realized in the bottom right corner of the window you could see a little boy's face, slightly pale skin, short black hair, and sad blue eyes. And ever since my pregnant aunt moved in my family will hear a baby crying in the storage room next to our bedrooms. My grandpa told me when he was a boy the house next door used to be the doctor's house and supposedly a few people died there, but I'm not sure what to believe. Then ever since my 15th birthday I've begun to see a tall shadow figure anywhere I go. I'll go on dates with my boyfriend now and I'll always see a tall dark figure in the corner of the room watching, but when you've seen it in a large crowded place like Walmart it begins to make you worry. Whenever we're at his house I'll always see it in the lower den or even the stairways. He's never seen it but he'll joke about seeing it near the highway always when driving home. I wanted to believe I was just a paranoid girl who needed help, but a few nights ago the figure actually attacked me. I was laying in bed when I noticed a scratching noise from across the room in the storage room. A few minutes later I noticed a black shape moving, so when I finally looked over I was immediately attacked. It grabbed my ankle and started dragging me across my bedroom floor. My legs started to go numb as I tried fighting back. Immediately after blinking it disappeared. I was so scared I literally slept on the porch with my dogs just to feel safer. When I was changing, that's when I noticed my right leg was covered in bruises from my ankle to my knee. They're almost faded now, but I've been a lot more cautious about being in my room. Any help or advice would be greatly appreciated. Hey, this is my first time posting. I've been having experiences since I can remember. So about a year ago I was visiting my sister. Before I left her house I was feeling rather depressed, because I didn't want to go home. I came to the conclusion that it had followed me home from my sister's. I was staying with a friend at the time. Well, that night things began to happen. It began with tapping under the bed. I could hear it and I asked my friend if she was taping on the bed. She said she thought it was me. I didn't think much of it until it started knocking on the walls and headboard. Then it would move to the end of the bed and knock around. It felt as if something was walking across my feet or trying to hold me down. It got to the point where I was crying. It was terrifying. It started dripping the covers off of me and turning on lights. It would open the nightstands. We would close them and it would open them again. This went on for hours every night. It would respond in very angry ways when we would tell it to stop. I moved 2 more times and it has been following me everywhere. The activity has died down a little bit, but things still happen every night. It has never tried to hurt me, but I feel threatened by it. I'm thinking it could be a poltergeist, but I'm not sure. I've never seen it. I think it attached to me because I'm not a very happy person and have had a troubled life. I'm to the point where I'm scared to even go to sleep. If anyone has any advice they can give me, please comment. Thank you. I have seen strange things all my life, starting when I was very young, maybe 6 or so. Since then I've mostly gotten used to it, however, sometimes it still creeps me out. The following are experiences that I have had with the unknown both in my home and at various places I have worked at. I begin with the most recent, that is last week. Fair warning, this is a long post. Wednesday I was putting my work things into the car. I turned around to throw something away and turned back in time to see the gas, oil mix container for our weed eater come flying off the shelf above my car. After cleaning that up and going back inside to wash my hands, when I stepped back out into the garage and reached back to shut the door, I distinctly heard an indistinct whisper followed by a growl. Thursday morning as I got up to go into work early, as I left my room to go upstairs, I heard what sounded like shuffling coming from behind the curtain that covered the doorway to our laundry and cat area. Of course I assumed it was my kitty and went to the stairs. When I looked up the stairs I saw my cat sitting there staring down at me. This is strange as she usually waits outside my door to meow at me when I get up. I looked around the corner at the cat area at the other end of the basement, by my room, to see what looks like a shadow of a person that then walks through the curtain. Nothing was found when I went to investigate. Since this all began, my cat has been extremely hesitant to stay downstairs for any length of time, and when she is let into my room she will pace around for a few seconds then demands to be let out. She will then book it back upstairs. I have been hearing what sounds like footsteps walking around upstairs when I am home alone. I will, of course, sneak upstairs to find out what's going on, only to find an empty house. On the rare occasions I do manage to get my fur baby to sleep on my bed, she will be sitting there, then suddenly will snap around and stare at part of the wall, ceiling, or will act like she's listening to, watching something. Whatever it is more than likely the thing I hear thumping my wall at night. My room is currently in the basement. Other than that it's been docile. Next up is the haunted mall I work at occasionally. This part will be my experiences along with ones from co-workers that verify what I have had happen. The location of this mall is withheld for privacy reasons and to protect the mall itself. I first started here last year when my company first won the contract. In the beginning we were all alone on night shift. One night, as I sat at our report writing PC, I felt someone looking at me. I had my back to the window so I turned around. There was a young boy staring in at me. At first I thought nothing of it, just waved and turned back around. Then I remembered a very important fact: our office is on the second story. Needless to say, when I turned back around, he was gone. In that first office, before we moved to the main office, if you closed and locked the door, you would clearly hear someone knocking on it. If you looked closely enough, you could see a shadow through the window. Nobody would ever be there when we opened it, however. You can hear children laughing at night when it gets quiet. If you looked across at the next building, Outdoor Mall, you could occasionally see shadows running back and forth through the vacant upstairs, which is unfinished. Once we moved into the main area, we had less of an issue with the boy. However, whilst sitting at the PC there after my co-worker had left, I heard women talking out in the hall. I thought it was our client coming in, so I got up to greet them. There was nobody out in the hallway or in the office. I went out to look for them and clearly saw that the only vehicle anywhere near our office was mine. I blew it off thinking I was tired and went back to the PC. Now it's around 2 a.m. at this point. I'm sitting there writing up my nightly report when I clearly hear, right in my ear, a woman's voice asking, "Are you ready?" I'm ready. I turned every single light on that I could find and blared music for the rest of the night. No idea what she may have been ready for, but I wanted no part of it. The vacant area under our building, formerly an underage nightclub, has a very negative feel to it. Even in the brightest, sunniest of days, if you entered, you would immediately feel unwelcome. I went in there once alone by myself at night to check the ambient temperature to make sure the pipes weren't going to freeze as the winter was harsh. I felt nauseous in that building. On my way out, I glanced to my left to see a large dark shadow person watching me. As I stared at it, it started moving towards me. I have never moved so fast in all my days. From that moment on, I made my co-worker, friend, who had seen creepy things as well, accompany me to all of the vacants. We both felt unwelcome in that first vacant, but we never saw the shadow dude when we stuck together. On to the other sightings. My former boss was walking by the building with the vacant upstairs one day. As he passed by a window, he looked up and noticed a young boy standing there staring down at him. He went inside to check and found no sign of anyone within. The janitor boss lady pulled into work one morning just before 6 a.m. The mall was completely silent and she was the only person there. As she sat in her car waiting for the clock in time, she looked up at the windows, our office building, and saw a young boy running up and down the hallway. She said she grabbed her things, ran inside her office downstairs and locked the door, as if that would stop anything. She called her boss demanding to know what was going on in the building, and his response after hearing her story was that they knew about the strange events and had seen them for themselves. This mall is a very strange place at night. During the day it's very peaceful, except for the Shadow Man vacant. We are still unsure as to the history of this place and where these spirits arose from. On to another haunted workplace. Again, the location is redacted as the higher-ups there refuse to admit to any activity, even though some was caught on camera. I began at this warehouse as a temporary special project overnight guard. My duties were to escort the construction workers around the building and to sit and watch from the golf cart as they rebuilt the conveyor system. The first few nights were peaceful, albeit boring. However, in about the middle of the week I started noticing odd things. The lights in the warehouse were motion activated, so most of the place was dark at night to conserve energy. I would notice the lights turn on one by one down an aisle, however, nobody would ever be visible to me. I ignored this for about an hour when I heard the sound of a woman laughing from behind me. I turned around and at the very end of the shipping area, behind the loading conveyors, I saw a dark figure running back and forth from the dock doors back to the aisle. I watched this for a while, then turned back around, trying to pretend it hadn't happened. Later on that night, about 0530, I was stationed by the overhead door, waiting for the contractors to finish their nightly cleanup. I heard a noise to my left and turned to look. About 20 feet away, standing by a support column, was the same dark figure I had seen at the other end of the building. I could make out no features on it at all. It was simply a solid black figure of a person. As soon as I made a move towards it, it ducked behind the column. I ran over to look and it was gone. There was nothing around for it to hide behind except that column. Shortly after that I was awarded with a permanent position alternating between the truck entrance and the front desk. The truck entrance was peaceful, never had any issues with it. However, the front desk was extremely uncomfortable to be at alone on the weekends, day or night. As the warehouse closed Saturday to Sunday, there was no one around except for myself up front and the guard at the truck entrance. It was very common to hear footsteps coming down the hallway to the right of the interior security window. They would stop shortly before a person would normally be seen from the window, then turn around and go back down the hall. One day, as I sat at the desk, I heard the footsteps again. After they retreated back down the hall, I heard chains being rattled and a crashing noise. After summoning the guard from the gate up front, I went back to find that the chain-link gate that closed off the kitchen area had been ripped open and has partially hanging from its track. That gate was normally alarmed, yet no alarm ever sounded that day. Another day I was by myself, Thanksgiving actually, so I was annoyed at being at work rather than with my family. The footsteps started up again. I was already irritated, so I yelled at them to stop, that nobody cared about it and that it was getting annoying hearing it wander around. The sounds stopped dead. Whilst I was congratulating myself on stopping it, something black crashed into the window facing the parking lot. I ran over to the window but saw nothing, no dead birds that could have caused it or anything. I backed up to my chair, watching the window the entire time. As I sat down, I turned to my right and froze. There, in the interior area behind the security glass where the employees enter, was the same dark man. As I looked at it, it started beating on the security glass, almost like it was punching it. I covered my head and yelled out that I was sorry I yelled at it. When I looked back up, it was gone. Then I heard the footsteps retreating back down the hallway. Never again did I yell at it or any other thing I heard. That was enough of a warning for me. Now for one of the earliest experiences in my current house, the one I now sleep in the basement of. Before I was in the basement, my room was upstairs on the front corner. I was on my computer watching videos when I heard a woman humming, almost singing, coming from my left. I didn't think too much of it at first as the window is there. I thought someone was walking by. My cat, who was curled up on my bed, suddenly sat bolt upright staring at the heating vent on the floor. She then ran out the bedroom door into the living room. I got up and went out to find all three cats, mine and my parents too, sitting lined up in front of the open basement door staring downstairs at the spare room. My cat, who was on the end, kept looking back and forth from me to the stairs, as if trying to tell me something. I ran back in my room, shut the door and blared music until my parents got home. Shortly after moving to the basement, my cousin and my young nephew were over. We decided to play hide and seek to help keep my nephew entertained. My cousin decided to hide in the spare room whilst I went for the cat area. 5 seconds go by and my cousin comes flying out of the spare room cursing, saying that something had whispered his name into his ear. I have more experiences that I will type up at some point, and as more happen all the time I will add them when I can. At this point I've accepted the fact that I will likely always see, hear things of this nature. Hopefully they don't drive me crazy. One day last year, after learning of an online ghost story contest, I sat down at the dining room table to comprise my thoughts. I did have a story from my youth that I thought might fit the guidelines, the most significant being the story had to be a true happening and a personal happening. I had this one idea dash. I had no longer than turned on my word processor when I found myself jumping to my feet. To a loud crashing sound, to glass shattering, a sudden, loud, unexpected jarring to the otherwise quiet in the room. Leaving the table immediately, I moved to investigate the cause and discovered the following. It was glass for sure, a flat amber strip of it, or more precisely, a fragment about 6 inches in length of it had survived the cause of the noise. I recognized these glass shards immediately, and where it had all come from, looking up, for it was part of a much larger strip of amber-colored glass that had served as a lens cover for a recessed light bulb, where it had sat snugly inside a sturdy wood housing made just for this illuminated top piece to what's really a very nice piece of fine furniture. A European-style hutch. I had purchased this heavy-duty hutch while living overseas. It's comprised of 6 segmented large stand-up decorative darkwood pieces, complete with glass shelves, a mixture of wood and wood-framed crystal doors, with drawers of varying sizes, all intended as one large display piece, all that. And of course that built-in light bulb enhancement, with amber glass covers that I now bring more to your attention. There are 6 of those enhancements, 1 each, sitting at top of each individualized piece. And it might be of interest to know that these amber glass covers are extremely lightweight, and fragile, thin rectangular strips, 3 feet long and 3 inches wide, and no thicker than normal window glass. And because of this obvious fragility, I always took extreme care in handling. Once set in position, where human intervention is no longer a requirement, they remain securely protected regardless of said fragility. To position this glass is a one-time thing done at assembly or reassembly and then left alone. It's a very simple procedure where each glass strip is inserted, one by one, carefully, at a 45-degree angle or better, into their respective wood holder, and once fully inside the holder where it becomes parallel with the wooden rails, the glass is simply lowered by hand so as to lie flat against the rails. That very simple procedure, along with gravity, holds the glass securely inside their respective retaining rails. A flip of the light switch and light from these amber lenses cascades softly down and over the hutch, giving a very nice mellow effect to the whole. Not that said mellow effect is important here, but what is where I've placed the hutch as it sits high upon the second floor landing, away from traffic, overlooking the entire living area below. Now please accept when I say I have always exercised extreme care in the shipping and preparation and handling of the individual hutch pieces. To attest to this, the hutch was purchased in Belgium many years ago and shipped to my Heidelberg address where it initially rested in place for 4 years. I then moved it and reassembled same at yet another overseas address where it remained for 1 more year, and all without incident. I prepared the hutch pieces for its move subsequently across the ocean to my then stateside address in western Maryland, where it was once again reassembled, without incident, and where it remained all fine and dandy for nearly 18 years. And, then, finally, the hutch was moved to my current home here in Texas where it had been sitting, complete with amber glass, and all, undisturbed, for 3 years. Me saying closer to 4 years would be more correct. So 4 years. Now all that might have been as boring as hell to come to learn, but I'd like to say, there's no damn way that glass rectangle just up and jumped out of its protective housing. Let's say that even if it had cracked from some unknown related stresses, which I do not believe was the case, it would still have remained intact due to those retaining rails. And just as factual it would be correct to say it would have to have come out just as it went in, complete, first being raised at the necessary angle to allow for clearance, and then just as carefully removed. So how did it happen then? Because it was certainly those shattered pieces there on the floor. And the wood frame remains intact and in good working order, doing their job, just sitting there. No one bumped the hutch, no one was up there on the second floor landing or nearby it to be able to disturb anything, and there was no earthquake, no vibration from a passing vehicle. My home sits a good distance from a less than busy street in a rural setting, no strong winds, no mice, no cats, no nothing as far as I can see other than turning to the supernatural, and me, coincidentally, then, in the beginning processes of a ghost storytelling. There were and are 5 other similar amber glass covers. They are still in position where they remain today, with just one empty space to leave me wondering. I have a feeling something didn't want me to share the ghostly happening I was about to put into print. A story I eventually titled Coffin Nails. But whatever it was, whatever lifted that glass rectangle and allowed it to come crashing down, as it did, sure took my mind off any storytelling. For a while anyway. Sincerely, Jerry Bridges. I live in a house with another 5 family members, therefore we all have experienced something over the 18 years we have stayed in this house. We begin after I was born. My mum realized strange things were happening with me as a baby. I kept staring at something that wasn't there. Over the years I grew up, I was having really bad dreams and saying really strange and scary things to my mum. I don't remember much of this. I used to tell my mum about someone tickling my feet when I was sleeping. The first experience I vividly remember was when I was about 10 years old. My older brother told me that he heard footsteps the previous night, so of course didn't believe him at all, and the next night as I fell asleep I woke up to a loud bang and footsteps running down the hall. Of course, this being the first time ever since I was little experiencing this, I was terrified. Over the years this carried on a lot more. It was also increasing. I heard many things over the past years, such as footsteps, whispers. In the kitchen I heard glass breaking and pots and pans banging, doors swinging open, not feeling alone in knocks. No one believed me until my mum and my little sister has had their fair share of this. It stopped for a while, until a couple of nights ago when my older brother heard the bathroom door banging and noises, such as stuff falling off the shelves, but he went in there and nothing was different. He finally believes me. I just have a question that I can't figure out. Why is it always me experiencing this stuff? So, where to start? At the beginning, I guess. From the time I was a little girl, up until around a year ago, I have been followed by a dark presence from house to house. It started when I was about 5 years old and we moved back to Wigan after my parents had split up for the first time. At first we lived in my grandparents' house, which was fine, but then my granddad found us a very old, dilapidated farmhouse built circa 1700 which he refurbished for us to live in. My bedroom was on the first floor and separated from my parents' and brother's bedrooms, which were on the other side of the house. For as long as I can remember, I was terrified by a cupboard in my room, which always seemed to have a door slightly ajar, regardless of how often I would shut it. Although I never heard or saw anything, at night I would be paralyzed with fear and unable to move, or even breathe, as I could sense something over my bed, watching me. Whatever it was not good. The feeling this thing gave off was very, very dark. Every night I would have nightmares and wake up terrified, sensing this thing was there. So, this went on for years, with my mother denying that there was anything in the house. She herself had experienced hauntings on a few occasions as a child and thought she would know if there was something in the house. She was either trying to comfort me, or very, very wrong. Other than the nightly presence, not much happened in that house, other than lights being turned on and off when no one was there to do it. Also, I found the staircase which led up to my bedroom to be extremely creepy as well. Years later my dad admitted to me that sometimes he would be watching TV, minding his own business and not thinking of much else, when all of a sudden he would be overwhelmed with a feeling of being watched by something horrible from the bottom of the stairs, very similar to what I had experienced. When I was about 10, we moved from that house to another in Cumbria. I thought that this would be a new start, that the thing would now leave me alone. Not so much. When we first moved into the house it was also being refurbished, so for a while, we slept in a caravan in the backyard. After a few weeks, my brother and I began to hear tapping on the window directly behind our beds. To start with, we blamed one another for the noises, each thinking it was the other one playing tricks. For a while we also tried to tell ourselves that there must be something loose on the caravan blowing in the wind, but when we checked, there was nothing there. Later, after we moved into our own bedrooms in the house, the comfort of being able to tell myself that my brother was playing tricks soon disappeared, as the tapping started on my bedroom window, which there was no chance anyone could access from anywhere else in the house. Again, as soon as we were back in the house, I began to sense the presence at night and often during the day when I was in the house alone. Often, when I was in my bedroom, I would hear what I thought was my dad walking up the stairs, even to the point of hearing the change jangling in his pocket, but then when I would look around, everyone would be downstairs. One night I was in the bathroom and even heard the tapping while I was relaxing in the bath. Eventually, a few years later, I was in my bedroom when I suddenly heard an almighty bang on the wall behind me, which led onto a corridor and had a radiator on it. Thinking the radiator must have fallen off the wall, I ran out to see nothing. Nothing had moved, but the bang was so loud, there's no way that this could be the case. After that the tapping mostly stopped. After this point, when lying dozing off to sleep, I started to see endless faces, totally sharp, clear images of faces I had never seen before. They were often grotesque and vaguely terrifying. Each face was accompanied with an associated feeling, all of which were very sad, dark and depressing. I didn't feel that they were necessarily trying to scare me, I think that they wanted to be seen. I then moved from that house to a shared house in my local town. The presence never left, and at night I would often wake with terrible nightmares. Music would turn on of its own accord and stuff would go missing, only to turn up in weird places. As it was a shared house, the residents would often talk about this, and many had similar experiences. One night, I was sitting on my bed and all of a sudden this energy, for want of a better description, suddenly rushed me. I literally felt it pass through me, and it was one of the weirdest sensations I have ever felt. For some reason, after that point, I felt convinced that it was an old man. To my horror, a few weeks later a taxi driver picked me up from the house and said that the last time he was at the house an old man had died and was being wheeled out. I never mentioned anything to him. Although this was probably just coincidence, it didn't help with the overall creepiness of the house. Not long after that I met someone, we moved in together, and before long I was pregnant. Now just before I got pregnant, I woke up from the most terrifying and vivid dream. Basically in the corner of the room, there was a shining white presence. I was too terrified to look at it, but I felt that it was somehow projecting energy at me. During the dream, there was a really intense buzzing on the back of my neck but the weird thing was that when I woke up, I could still feel it. This was seriously freaky. After my daughter was born, the toys in her room would turn on randomly, but the thing that surprised me most happened one day in the kitchen. I was feeding her and she was in her high chair. In the corner of the room behind her there was a heavy glass door which was open. All of a sudden she started looking over my shoulder and laughing, and then held out her hand and offered her food to someone off to my left, all the while looking like she was making eye contact and giggling. Literally, a second after this, the glass door suddenly closed on its own. I had lived there for 5 years and not once, either before or after, did that door even move slightly, never mind shut fully. Now you would think I would be terrified, but no. It was really strange, as a feeling of calm came over me and I started to laugh. I have no idea who it was, but it was nice to know that not all the spirits around me are horrible. So, we then moved to another house. I still heard things, saw the faces, felt the presence, but really only 2 things of note happened there. Once, I was in the kitchen and looked out the window. We had a rockery in the front garden, and all of a sudden, in full daylight, I saw, well, a black mass is the best way I can describe it. It moved a bit like the way mist does, but I dunno, more like something out of a sci-fi film, or Mercury maybe. It was darker than anything I have ever seen before. It started on the top of the rockery, then slowly moved downwards, curling round the rocks as it went, and then went under one and disappeared. Still find that one very weird. The second thing that happened was more creepy. I was lying in bed one night and dozing off when all of a sudden, I heard a really horrible laugh which came from nowhere. I ran to the bedroom light to turn it on, suddenly it blew. Then I went to the stair light to turn it on, and that also blew. So I'm standing in the house in pitch black with this thing, which I can feel is there and is very much getting off on the fact that I'm terrified. I ran downstairs. Thankfully the lights there worked, but I spent the rest of the night totally freaked out. The next day I was putting some washing away in a cupboard, and again, I felt this presence right up behind me, rushing at me and trying to freak me out. Also, while in that house, I was often woken by the sound of the doorbell, or knocking so real that I would actually get up and answer the door in the middle of the night. So, after that point, my partner and I split up and I met someone else, who I eventually moved in with. Now this guy is an uber skeptic. Seriously, Richard Dawkins has got nothing on him. In fact, he is so skeptical that I don't think it would even be possible for a ghost to exist in his presence. Ever since we lived together I have had varied experiences, save for this last one. So, I still felt the presence on occasion, although not as often as in the past. My boyfriend and I had fallen asleep on the couch. I dreamed that I was led into the living room by what felt like a small child who was holding me by the hand. I could see my boyfriend asleep on the couch, and weirdly, I could also see myself. Except that standing over me, deep in some sort of trance, was this really creepy-looking old guy with a brown hooded robe. In the dream I was terrified and ran over to wake my boyfriend up so he could help me, except that as I touched him, my hands kept going through his shoulders. It was so weird. Then I woke up, obviously back in my body, but while I was wide awake, I could feel a really dark energy pressing on me, almost trying to merge with me or something. I have actually felt this after waking up before, and it has taken a long time for it to dissipate. Anyway, a few days before I had read on a website which said that if you were ever being bothered by a presence, you needed to call for Jesus and he would protect you. Well, at the time, not being Christian or even thinking that Jesus was likely to ever have actually existed, I thought, yeah, whatever. Not so much at 3 in the morning after that dream. In my head I was telling this thing to go away and trying to push it out, best way I can describe it. I was so terrified, that not even really believing, almost amused with myself, I said, if you don't go away, I'm going to go and get Jesus. Well, imagine my shock when this thing literally bounced out of me. It was like the opposite of the feeling of being rushed. I actually felt it, in the negative dark feeling, leave my body. It was completely bizarre. My whole life I have lived with terrible anxiety and depression, but since that day, nothing. Don't get me wrong, there are still traces, but the obsessive negative thoughts are now mostly gone. Nowadays I rarely feel anything. I think the presence is probably there as I'm typing this, but I can't actually feel it. I think it might be to do with your beliefs. If you believe you have no power, if you believe that it is evil and it can scare you, then it will. But equally, if a negative spirit who wants to harm you can exist, so can a positive spirit who wants to protect you. It took me years to realize this, but once it dawned on me and I asked for help, it worked. I think in my case I was desperate and scared enough to actually believe it. So yeah, if you too have horrid things bothering you, try that, but you really have to mean it. Even works for non-believers, good old Jesus. So, I say that nothing happened after this, but I do still see the faces, and a few nights after, I got one of those flashbulb faces and it looked exactly like the guy in my dream. He was so sad and miserable and unhappy I actually felt sorry for him. I don't think these spirits are actually evil. I think that they might just be people who have lived horrible lives and are too scared to cross over, perhaps because of things that they've done, so they have to hang around here, leeching energy off the living, and when they find someone who is sensitive, it's like nectar to a bee. I actually think that they find positive feelings unbearable, a bit like Voldemort in Harry Potter. I also think that seeing them as they are, rather than feeling afraid or angry towards them, is protective in some way, perhaps because they can't stand anyone feeling sympathy or kindness towards them. I don't know if he's still listening, but I've tried to tell him about crossing over and that no one will hurt him, or judge him, other than himself, and that even then there will be people there to help him through it, but I don't know if it has helped. I've also asked my guides to try to help him, and I think that this has got to be a better way than living in fear and perpetuating the situation. Sadly, since this point, my son started to hear tapping on his window and saw an old man's face, so I think when he got bounced from me, he tried to go elsewhere for sustenance. I've explained to my son though, and he isn't too scared either, but I keep my eye on him just in case. He knows to shout for Jesus too, lol. So this is the second part of my story, Hauntings in New House Part 1. This story is about a different house, where we moved in mid-2010. We left the one mentioned in the previous story due to monetary issues. All was well and good in this house, but only for a few months. First occurrence, S. One day I came back from school and decided to watch TV, so I proceeded towards our bedroom. When I reached there I noticed the silhouette of a woman standing there, then it quickly disappeared. I never gave it much of a thought because I thought my mind's playing tricks on me as I was tired. A few months later, I saw this woman again. She was standing just in front of me in the living room, so I could see her more clearly. She was a frail old lady, maybe in her 70s or 80s, and was wearing a white saree that widows used to wear. Before I could ask who she is, she again disappeared, much to my disappointment. Later I got to know it was the apparition of the mother of our landlord who died in the ground floor bedroom, ours, due to some illness, a good 5-6 years ago. After that incident I became a little more religious and prayed to God daily. Second occurrence, S. Nothing happened after those incidents for at least half a year. But during late 2011 I caught a fever. It was increasing day by day. Besides that, I was having really vivid nightmares. I know this isn't a dream interpretation site. In those dreams, I was either crushed to death by some huge rock or choked to death by someone. Every single day, same dream, same sequences. When I told my parents about it, they became worried and prayed for my safety. A few hours later, they gave me a metal key and pics of Madriga and Macaulay to keep under my pillow. That night, I had a different dream of some invisible force protecting me from something evil and my fever came down considerably. A few months later, one night I was trying to sleep, but I heard my mom whispering me by my nickname. She was awake at the time. I asked if she called me. No, not at all, came her answer. I heard that voice 2 more times calling me. It scared me and I decided to pray to God and to sleep. Next day, upon asking my parents what was that I heard and if they heard it, they denied it but said it was Anishi calling me. Upon asking what's that, they replied tantrics call a person 3 times in a row. They trick them into answering by imitating a family member's voice. If that person answers that call, their soul is forever trapped by the tantric and exchanged with a weaker one. That person dies immediately. I'm glad I didn't answer it. Later we got to know my mom's childhood neighbor was doing dark magic on us for her mother-in-law's long and healthy life by sacrificing the weakest person in our family, me. After those incidents nothing happened for at least a year. During early 2014 my mom died of thyroid cancer. It was a brutal battle of survival for her and I was glad she'll finally rest in peace now, but I was wrong. Third occurrence, S. A few months later one night, I woken up by the urge to drink water around 4 a.m. After I drank some, I decided it was time to sleep now. As I drifting off I saw a shadow enter the room and sit on my chair. Dad was sleeping beside me, so I knew it wasn't him. Then studying the silhouette carefully, I knew it was my mom. I was scared at first but then I became calm. She watched for a few minutes and upon noticing I was awake, she quickly disappeared through the door. Next day when I told my dad about it and he believed me. A few months after that incident, one day I was all alone doing something, I don't remember now, in the living. A few minutes later I heard someone scratch the wall in the kitchen. It was just beside the living room. It wasn't some rodent or pest because we clean our kitchen thoroughly every day. Then I called out to the air, "Mom, is that you?" Immediately the scratching stopped. I became emotional and told her how much I love her and miss her and that she needs to go to the light. I never saw or heard of her again, though she visits sometimes in my dreams. Thanks for reading. I know it was a bit boring and long. I'm sorry about that. I have many more experiences, which I'll share soon. Have a good day. Best wishes and regards. Sweet Sunshine 1800. Being born into a heavily military-based family, I was quickly stationed with my father and mother in a small, 2-bedroom apartment right outside of infamous Frung, Germany. Growing up, my father was very busy, so me and my mother traveled around the cities, looking at castles and reveling in the immense culture around us. German quickly became my first language, starting off small, counting and repeating things I heard on the television, and expressing myself in small sentences to my mother, who spoke very little German. She quickly began to teach me English, which I began to use more fluently to communicate as I grew older. However, this is not a story of my later years in Germany. This is my story of when my sixth sense began. My mother tells me the stories often, reminding me how I was born like her grandmother, who I am properly named after. Her grandmother was a vessel for the supernatural, hearing them, seeing them, feeling them, and being able to communicate with them. The trait thinned out through the next generation. My mom only being able to sense the past, my aunt interacting with them, my grandmother hearing their whispers. Luckily neither of my sisters can experience these things, maybe just a shadow or two now and again. I, however, am just like my great-grandmother, and that was apparent only months after I was born. It started when my mother would lay me down to sleep, flicking on the baby monitor and heading to bed. Early in the night, she would hear me laughing and babbling. She describes it as if someone was standing above my crib, tickling me. My mother would come into the room, and flick on the lights. I then would start to become inconsolable, screaming and crying, my face bright red, and neither of my parents could stop me. She'd sit in the room with me, waiting for me to fall asleep. Then I started talking to people behind my mom, nothing understandable, just babbling. Taking toys over and handing them to an unseen person. Waving my hands, like I was explaining things to them. Just a child's imagination. Things quickly became clear after one night my mom heard me talking to someone in my room. She rolled over, 2 a.m. Why was I up, and who was I talking to? She sat up quietly in the bed, trying not to wake my father. She leaned in close to the monitor, and heard my toys going off. How did I get out of my crib? She walked to my bedroom, only to open the door and witness something out of a paranormal movie. I was laughing and sitting in my crib, while electronic toys and stuffed animals danced around the crib. I clapped and laughed, never noticing my mother. She flicked on the light, and everything stopped. The noises stopped. The toys fell to the floor. I just sat in my bed giggling and clapping. Not knowing what was to become of my life. I've had this stuff happen to me all my life. Most were just little things. As I told my wife before we were married, I wish the stuff didn't happen, but it has. I suppose I'll start by sharing a few of the small things that have happened over my 54 years in Mississippi. I suppose the earliest event that was totally inexplicable was when I was around 12-13, when my mom and I were sitting up watching The Tonight Show after my dad has gone to bed. The house was built by my parents, so there had been no history in that house prior to our living there. The den where we were sitting was on the opposite end of the house from the formal living room. My mom was super anal about that room and really didn't want anyone spending any time in it because she kept it in a state of perfection. In her mind, anyway. To the point, we heard a loud crash coming from the living room, which we both commented afterwards we'd been certain was this heavy large punch bowl which had been sitting on her huge antique dining table. We both looked at each other, immediately, with that WTF expression on our faces. Expecting to see the punch bowl in umpteen pieces on the floor, when we opened the door and turned on the light. Of course. Nothing. Nothing whatsoever was broken or appeared out of place. Later in life, more than a few things happened in this house, but I'll get to some of those in later stories. Let's see, the next small type event or events I can recall happened before my first wife and I were married, and we were living in a very small rented house in the Belhaven area of Jackson, Mississippi. It was just a tiny 4-room house. Well, long story short, several times during the 4 months we lived there, we'd hear a murmur of voices which sounded like they were coming from the kitchen. It was not loud like a group of people were actually in the kitchen, but as if it were a distance away with source of the sound centered in the kitchen. The sound was clearly a group of people talking, as if at a gathering of some sort, but you could never make out distinctly anything that was being said. Whenever we walked into the kitchen to check it out, or even walk around the outside of the house to find it, the voices would just become inaudible. My ex told me that there had been some sort of untimely death of young people in the house in the 1960s, but that's been so long ago, I don't recall what it was she said was supposed to have happened. I have no way of knowing where she'd heard that story or anything concerning the veracity of the statement. I don't really recall anything else happening there while we were at that house. The house was torn down sometime in the 1990s, and though I drove by there recently, I don't recall what is there now. Nothing impressive, obviously. So many little things to tell at different locations, but the events themselves were isolated and not impressive enough to justify setting up the background to get to the point. The ex and I moved to a small rural village south of Jackson about 40 miles and moved into a turn-of-the-century home that we worked on restoring, renovating while we lived there. It had been burned down at one time and was rebuilt from, as I was told, the wood from an old hotel in a mid-18th century boomtown down the road that eventually died away when the railroad bypassed it. I'll share a couple of more interesting events from this home in a subsequent story, but for this introduction, I'll keep it short. We were standing in a hall that runs lengthways along one side of the house and heard a huge crash that was obviously breaking glass. From where we were standing, it obviously came from the kitchen, which was the room at the very end of the hall. Being poor at the time, we were dreading finding a broken window, which is exactly what it sounded like. Again, when we got there, nothing. Also smelled strong lilac perfume in this house quite often, but I'm pretty sure that was just residual from the many years an old lady had lived in the house. Probably just the humidity or air pressure or something would cause it to ebb and wane. Finally, in the early 80s I was in a band that shared a loft in a commercial building on State Street in Jackson with about 2-3 other bands to split the rent. There was a straight stairwell from the street that led up to the loft on the right side of a landing. A commercial screen printing business was on the opposite side of the landing. When you first went into the loft, there was a single larger room that everyone would leave equipment, instruments in, and further behind it was an approximately 6x8 opening into a practice room. There was no door between the practice room and the first room. When you were in the practice room, or with your back turned to the entrance in the first room, for that matter, I don't know what it was about that loft, but you could just tell when someone walked in. The sound would change, or maybe the air pressure changed, who knows, but you could feel it when someone came into the loft, someone picking up equipment, visitor, guest, whatever. Well, anyway, I'm sure everyone who ever spent any time up there was familiar with the experience of practicing in the practice room and knowing someone had come in, only to look around through the entrance and no one was there. We joked, it was the ghost, but I never even entertained that seriously for a moment. I can conservatively say that I shared that experience with band members more than a dozen times over the 2-3 years we used that loft. One day, my guitar player told me that he ran into someone who worked at the screen printing place who asked him, "Have you met the ghost?" Supposedly, employees at the screen print shop were familiar with poltergeist-type activity such as machines turning on by themselves, lights turning off, and a door closing and locking on its own. I never experienced any of that, though. The story from the employee was that a notorious gambler in the 1940s had been having an affair with a married woman and was killed in the building. Again, I have no way of knowing whether anything concerning that tale is true or not. The entire building was destroyed in the early 90s to create a parking lot. Okay, lots of other little things over the years, such as seeing an ashtray fly off a windowsill and just running across my deceased mom's Thanksgiving Day menu on Thanksgiving Day 10 years after she'd passed, but those stories are not really worth the setup to get to the punchlines, which I just gave away, so I'll leave these here for now with 2-3 more involved and meaningful stories to come. So when I was about 13 years old, my friend and I had this immense fascination with the paranormal. He had a few spots on his parents' vast property in Mineral Point that were eerie themselves before we ever even stumbled upon the thought that there may be spirits there. One night we were watching a Ghost Hunters TV show and saw that they were using EVPs. We thought that was a fantastic idea and tried to capture our own. We set out a tape recorder and proceeded to ask questions. After about an hour of recording we listened to the tape, but it was to no avail. There was nothing on there. We were young and hopeful though, so we set out again the next night to try again. This time we chose a different location. Behind his house was this old, dilapidated stone building that looks like it was once used for storage and possibly a cellar. We set out the tape recorder and again we started to ask questions. When we went back to listen to the tape we had almost given up hope that we were going to be able to capture anything. But in the last minute or so of the about 30-minute long tape, we heard what sounded to be a muffled voice. As we continued to listen it got louder and louder, but we were still unable to make out what it was saying. Then it went silent, almost as if the batteries on the recorder had died. Then as clear as day we heard a raspy voice say, "Help me." I know what you're thinking, cliché right? But that is what we heard. Being 13 years old, this scared the SD out of us. It wasn't until after that night that strange things started happening to me. At first it was minor things. I remember sitting at home one night. Keep in mind, none of these subsequential events took place at the original property where we heard the recording. As I was saying, I was at home on the computer and I swear I saw someone out of the corner of my eye walk across the hallway from the bathroom into my bedroom. I went to investigate and I didn't see anybody. However, I couldn't help but notice a strange, ominous feeling come over me and I felt as if I was being watched. Things started to escalate, getting stranger and stranger. One night I was home alone. Both of my parents worked nights at the time, so this was not a rare occurrence. I was watching TV and I noticed the volume was getting louder and louder, but there was no indication, such as numbers on the screen, that I or anybody else was pushing the volume button. It eventually got so loud I had to unplug the TV. I plugged it back in and it was back to its original volume. On a separate occasion, my dad had asked me to go outside and grab something out of his truck for him. I opened the door but did not enter the truck, more so I was just leaned in and grabbed what I needed to grab. As I turned around I was face to face with an older gentleman. I had never seen this man in my life and he looked sickly. I asked if I could help him and he did not respond. I ran back into the house to tell my parents that there was a sick-looking man in the driveway. We went back out to see if we could help him and there was no trace of him. He was gone. Or had he vanished? A few years later I moved to Milwaukee when I was 19 with some friends from school. The house was a rather large house but it was old. Everything was fine there during the day. But as soon as it got dark out there was something strange that would happen. That same eerie feeling I got, like I was being watched when I was younger, would wash over me. One night I was laying on the couch watching Netflix and I heard the creaking of what sounded like someone walking slowly through the living room. This was strange because all of my roommates were either sleeping or hanging out in their rooms. I quickly forgot about it and went back to watching Netflix. A few minutes later I heard it again, but this time it was louder. It sounded like they were running towards the back door, which I could see from where I was sitting. I stared at the door and suddenly it opened as if someone was walking through it. It did not fly open or gently creak open. It opened just as if any regular person were going to walk through the doorway. A year later I moved back to my hometown. I found a Ouija board at my parents' house that was made in the 60s. I thought it would be fun to take over to my friend's house and see what would happen. While we were using it, my friend and I suddenly went from being wide awake to just completely exhausted to the point where we could barely stay awake. But as soon as we said goodbye and put the board away, it was like our energy had been replenished. I took the board back to my parents' house and placed it back in the cabinet where I had found it. I latched the cabinet and was on my way out of the room when I heard it unlatch and open slightly. I thought nothing of it. I must have not latched it tight. So I fixed it. A few hours later I walk by and I notice that it is unlatched and open again. I asked my parents if either one of them had opened it and they said no. They had not even been in that room. Here I am now. I am 22 years old and I live in Madison now. It's been probably a year since anything strange has happened. Until the other night when I was in my room and my roommate was in his. When suddenly we heard a loud bang and both of our doors had opened about halfway. Our doors were securely latched, not to mention they stick shut half the time anyway. So they couldn't have just been blown over by the wind or bumped into. They were deliberately opened by someone or something. Now I don't know if any of these occurrences are connected or what. I'm not really frightened by any of them anymore. I've never felt as if I was in danger. I was just wondering if anybody could shed some light on them. Thank you. This is my first story here and I hope it makes sense. It will probably be a bit rambly, but I'll do my best to cover the basics and not rant too much. It's also perhaps worth disclosing that as a child I used to sleepwalk and still now I experience sleep paralysis on a regular basis, although I don't know how much the latter has to do with any paranormal activity. Growing up, I've experienced a few ghostly phenomenon from time to time. For example, I used to see the shadow of what I believed to be a man sitting at the foot of the bed whenever I stayed at my nan and granddad's. This happening every night I stayed there without fail, and I did mention it to my granddad once, but I don't think he ever believed me. As this was only a yearly visit because they lived so far away, I never thought much of it, although as a child it was a bit unsettling. I've also done a few ghost hunts/tours/walks, many times of which I've experienced something, mostly mild like something brushing my back, hands, but no one being near me, or a strange coldness, but at the same time much of this could be explained by me looking for something or just heightened senses of the group playing off one another. I lived with my mother until I was 18, and in that time witnessed a few things. I was a very timid child and shared a bed with my mum up until I was about 14-15. My mum would always come to bed around 11ish, and not long after she did, we would both hear footsteps coming up the stairs. It sounded like they would pause on the landing, there would be a few more as if they were turning to come up towards the bedrooms, and then that was it. They would end as quickly as they had started. This happened a few times, and always when my mum had come to bed. She heard them too, but I don't remember it happening much after I started to sleep on my own. In addition to that, I still swear to this day I seen an old woman sitting in the living room when I passed by the door once. That was the only time I ever seen anything in the house, but there were noises here and there that sometimes freaked me out. The house was about 30-40 years old, and we were the first family to live in it. So fast forward to 8 years. I'm 26 now, and living on my own with my boyfriend and my doggy in a flat that used to be an old mill. Nothing particularly creepy had happened until now, but the things that are happening seem to be getting steadily more attention-seeking, maybe? The starting point was one night, around 4 a.m., my partner's laptop began playing music. I have an open-plan living room, kitchen, and it was sitting on the island that separates the two rooms. It wasn't connected to any mains, and my boyfriend swears he turned it off. We jumped up and turned it off at the time, obviously, and went back to sleep, not thinking too much about it because that on its own is fairly explainable. The second thing to happen was when my boyfriend went away for the weekend. It was around 9 p.m. I was sitting in my bed, and I heard a bang from elsewhere in the house. My dog went mental at this, and she normally doesn't react to noise, so I went to investigate in case something had fallen over. Upon finding nothing, I went back to my room, only to find all the lights and the TV off. I definitely didn't do this, and of course, being on my own, I was pretty scared. Nothing happened for a few weeks after that, aside from things being in places I don't remember moving them to, but that could have been my partner's doing, and hearing some bangs and knocks that had no reason behind them. The third thing, and probably the creepiest, was actually seeing the movement. If I am lying in bed, I can see directly into the bathroom if both doors are open. There is a wall mirror above the toilet, sink, and my boyfriend and I both witnessed a figure moving past the mirror and out into the hallway, and down as if going towards the living room. I shut the bedroom door at that point and since then haven't seen anything. The last thing to happen was 2 days ago. I dry my clothes in my spare room, which is next to the living room, mostly because it's the only space where a clothesline won't get in the way. I walked past to go to get a drink and all the clothes that were drying were on the floor, as well as the clothesline. I have a tiny dog who probably isn't capable of pulling the whole clothesline down without me hearing, but again, I feel like it's worth trying to explain these things organically rather than assuming straight away there's some sort of presence. As well as this, when I walked into the living room, my spice rack was empty and all of the herbs normally in them were on the floor. Again, I didn't hear any of this happen. I'm not sure if anything that has happened in my past is directly linked, but I wanted to mention it in case there's any explanations that those might tie into. Thanks to anyone that's read and will offer advice, it's all appreciated.